Chapter 10. Ellie. Gran seemed to be saying. The word formed on her lips with a slow gathering of effort. She was dying and must have known it. Despite the succession of strokes, they might have broken her physically, but behind the swimming eyes and dribbling mouth, that tenacious brain of hers was working as well as ever. I could feel its determination, its refusal to accept defeat. Death would be kept waiting a little longer yet. Ellie, that's what I thought, she said. That's as much sense as I could make of the slurred murmur I could only hear by stooping over her where she lay, twitching one forefinger in what might have been an attempt to beckon me closer. A school friend I never heard of, a sweetheart from a distant youth. That's what I assume an old woman was recalling, a stray fragment of the remote past in a vain attempt to hold death at bay. Nothing more, only a few hours left as rain beat against the windows of her bedroom at Treador House and a February dust blackened it into night. She drew her last laborious breath. Peacefully at home, aged 92, her obituary notice would say, after a short illness, Adelaide Napier died, with her family and her secrets gathered about her. Ellie. I recalled the sound of the word I thought it was meant to be as I drove away from Sam Vigus' bungalow that afternoon. Not north to Truro, but south to the National Trust Garden at Treslick, where I would walk alone and unquestioned by the steep wooded shores of the Fell and seek for answers in the dwindling autumn light. I could never say for sure what Gran had intended to communicate on her deathbed 9 years before, but now a name was far less likely than a confession. He lied. Yes, that could have been it. That could so easily have been the meaning, for Sam Burgess had lied. He'd admitted as much, and my grandmother had been responsible. That too he'd volunteered without any way of knowing. My own memory would supply as partial corroboration. Why did you do it, Mr. Vigus? Doreen was in her overhead with the fancy clothes your grandmother supplied on the Never Never. We owed her precious near £100, and it was going to take me Lord knows how long to pay it off. I would have done, mark you. It wouldn't have been easy, but I'd have done it. If your grandmother hadn't come to me whispering about alternatives, she wrote off the debt in exchange for your false testimony. That she did. I don't believe it. Yes, you do, boy. I can see it in your eyes. You already know it's the truth. Michael Lanyon was guilty. We both believed that. What I'd said at the Daniel Arms was proof enough to my way of thinking. Your grandmother just wanted to be sure of the outcome, she said, sure of justice. And since I didn't doubt where justice led, I didn't mind giving it a helping hand, not when it got me off the hook so quick and simple. Except there's more than one kind of hook. I've been dangling on another kind ever since. Gran told you what to say. No. She left that to me. She knew from Doreen that I'd reported seeing Lanyon and Tully together to the police. Well, I tongue like a barn door on a windy day, my old lady had. So your grandmother came to me and proposed that I say I'd heard something as well as seen, just to stiffen the arm of justice, was how she put it. In return, she would forget the debt. And he agreed. To my shame, I did. I went to Inspector Treffry and told him I'd held back on what I'd heard because of how bad it looked for Michael Lanyon, but conscience had got the better of me. Treffry was angry at first, but he was too pleased with the new evidence to keep that up for long, I'd bet. I thought at the time your grandmother wanted to make sure her brother Smurder didn't wiggle out of answering for what they'd done, but later when I heard how much came down to her from old man Carnworth's will, just how much richer he'd been than any of us, and thought, well, I felt sicker than a whipped dog. I don't mind admittingly. I'd help her make sure, all right, of putting more noughts on her bank balance than I ate boiled eggs in a week for the sake of barely £100 thrown away at Doreen's glad rags. You could have spoken out. With Michael Lanyon dead and no one likely to believe me, talk sense, boy. Your grandmother could have denied the Holy Ghost without turning her hair. And there was Doreen to consider. She didn't know, see, not a thing. Thought I'd cleared the debt with back pay from Curlews. She was a simple soul with no head for figures, so she never questioned it. Besides, I'd been taken for a fool right enough, but there's worse things than that to suffer, like being hanged for a crime you didn't commit on the basis of false evidence. But Michael Lanyon did commit it. You know that sure as I do. If you're so certain on the point, why are you telling me this? Because doubts creep in here. with the droughts and the unaccountable noises I hear when I lie awake at night, recollecting his face as he stared at me across the courtroom, and I don't see why I should be the one to bear them. To that extent, I realized as I walked through the woods at Treselic, Vickers had got what he wanted. I shared the burden with him now, I knew. Worse still, I suspected. Had Gran confided in any member of the family? Dad told him Mum. Dad had told Mum to ignore Vickers, to forget all about him. Why? Why so very adamant? I looked down through the trees at the King Harry ferry and listened to the steady clanking of his chain as I would in the thread left trading down my years. One lie was a single crack that could become 1,000 shadows lined in the smooth mantle of my family past and present. It didn't prove anything, it didn't vindicate anyone, but it meant I couldn't stop. Tully still held the key, more firmly than ever. Treffry had told me, and Nicky before me, that he could never be found. But then Treffry had called Sam Vickers a reliable man. The truth was he didn't want to find Tully, whereas I did. Maybe if Nicky had heard Vickers' confession, he wouldn't have been given up so easily. Maybe he'd have done what I was determined to do, track down Edmund Tully, wherever he might be hiding. Trust was another victim of Vickers' revelations. I didn't know who I could rely on and who I couldn't. Gran had spoken to me, no one else. She'd been dumb and inert for the best part of 2 days prior to my arrival, gathering her strength, perhaps ordering her thoughts. But why try to tell me at all? Because she judged I know what's best to do with information, or because she felt I was entitled to know what others already knew. Mum wouldn't have sent me to see Vickers if she had any inkling of what he meant to say. She at least was ruled out, but nobody else was, even Pam, which made it so much easier than it might have been to enter the flat at Tredoor House under covers of darkness that night and remove the photograph from the bureau while she did her bravely smiling rounds of the table in the restaurant. The chances were I'd be on my way before she noticed its loss, and even if I wasn't, it wouldn't occur to her that I might be the culprit. I drove down to the Truemouth Motel later and left Trevor's keys with the receptionist in an envelope addressed to him. The man himself was out, presumably drowned his sorrow somewhere. I was grateful to be able to slip away without needing to deflect any demands of his to hand over the incriminating half of the photograph. I had already decided to have a copy made for my use so that Pam could give the original to her solicitor if and when the time came. If a divorce was what she ultimately wanted, who was I to stand in her way? I looked in on her when I returned once more to Tredoor House and was reassured by her calmness. Nothing was amiss, other than the relatively trivial matter of her difficulties with Trevor. She already knew how Mum and Dad had taken the news because they'd been on the telephone at some length. I'm sorry about Dad, I said, working on the safe assumption that he'd offered to stand in for Trevor. You know what he's like. Don't worry, I think I'll manage to persuade him I can cope alone. Tabs is coming down for a few days anyway, so I've been able to say she'll supply all the help I need. Your flying visit's been a real help, Chris. It's made me face up to telling people. And Tabs has come up trumps. No hysterics, no demands for everything. Just level-headed practical sympathy. Where have you been since lunch, by the way? You can't have had your head under a car bonnet in Falmouth all afternoon. I called on Sam Vickers. Who? Her unawareness sounded genuine. She too was probably in the clear. An old customer Mum wanted to call on. When you see her, can you tell her preferably while Dad's out of the way? That there was nothing to do, nothing to what? She'll understand. Oh, all right. But you can tell her yourself if you like. She'll be here tomorrow night, but I won't be. I'm afraid I have to make an early start. Business is obviously booming. Well, I better keep busy, Pam, that's for sure. Once I was back in my room, I telephoned Emma. It was a relief to hear her voice and to know there was at least one person I could be completely open with. Something's happened and we need to discuss it, not over the phone. It's too complicated. Could we meet somewhere? Yes, of course. Where and when? I won early at the supermarket this week. I finished at 3. It's in Battersea. Why don't we say Battersea Park at 3:30? The bench is beside the boating lake. All right, I'll be there. Are you on something, Chris? Maybe. Well, that sounds better than definitely not. Not necessarily. How do you mean? I'll explain tomorrow. All right. But Chris, yes. Whatever it turns out to be, something or nothing. Thanks for Nicky. I mean, I know. The turmoil and anomaly of my first few weeks at Truro School enabled me to forget Nicky and his father's forthcoming trial, often for days at a stretch. Everything was new and confusing. Teachers, classmates, rooms, books, uniforms, all the intimidating components of senior school life. High on the hills with the city below, we sang in the chapel on the first day of term. Up in the sunshine we lived. Well, the sun didn't always shine, but the sense of separation from Truro that our lofty setting imbued in us was never dearer to me than then. Some of the pupils who'd come up with me from the prep department recalled how chummy I'd been with Nicky Lanyon, but those who hadn't were in the majority and were determined to be unimpressed by what they thought might be for dubious kind of fame. I was happy to let my connection with Nicky wither into something minor and inconsequential. Well, not happy exactly, but willing. I knew it was disloyal. I knew it was unworthy, yet pulled between the necessities of day-to-day survival and the slowly fading memory of our friendship, I let it happen. Nobody seemed to think it in the least odd that Nicky hadn't taken up his place at the school. After a while, it would have seemed perverse to suggest he'd ever been likely to. He had nothing to do with any of us. He'd become a stranger. But the name of Lanyon was known to all, and soon it would be blazoned across the front page of every national newspaper, let alone the West Briton and the Royal Cornwall Gazette. Soon the slack-water weeks of waiting would be over. The trial of Michael Lanyon and Edmund Tully for the murder of Joshua Connelworth was due to commence on 20th October. Amongst the dates of long-ago battles and long-dead kings that went into my mind and out again with every passing history lesson, that date, which no one had asked me to remember, lodged stubbornly and firmly as the calendar rolled round towards it. A few weeks beforehand, Dad's Daily Telegraph reported the hanging at Pentonville of two armed robbers, Jegarty and Jenkins, convicted back in July, when I'd been taking no interest in such things, of the murder of a motorcyclist who tried to stop them escaping from a raid on a jeweller's shop in London. Geraghty had done the shooting. Jenkins hadn't killed anyone, that was clear, but both men hanged. I couldn't help imagining that to Nicky reading the same report in Lodge House somewhere in Exeter. It would seem that he at least wanted it to be an ill omen. Battersea Park was bathed in crystalline sunlight, gilding the yellows and reds of the trees around the boating lake and etching the lines of the power station chimney beyond Queenstown Road. Children on their way home from school were playing with their mothers, and high notes of their carefree voices rising above the plaintive wail of the peacocks and the distant growl of the traffic. Emma looked odd, if not downright eccentric, wearing her flying jacket over her pale check supermarket uniform. She sat beside me on a bench close to a formless Barbara Hepworth sculpture, listening patiently as I recounted what I learned in Cornwall. I expected her to react with relief or outrage. She was entitled to both. Instead, when I'd finished, she gave me a sympathetic smile and said, "I'm sorry, Chris." "You're sorry?" "It can't be very nice to learn your grandmother stooped to bribing a witness. I'd say it was closer to blackmail than robbery. Whatever you call it, it weakens the case against my father, though, right?" "It does, but don't get carried away. Do I look as if I'm likely to?" "Well, no." She looked tired and dispirited when she arrived, the effect, I assumed, of a mind-numbing shift on the supermarket checkout. Even now she remained subdued, saddened perhaps by the thought that Nicky had thrown away the chance to make the same discovery as me. But that wasn't quite true. Even though I felt it myself, it had been Nicky's suicide to flush Sam Vickers out of the undergrowth. Nicky had to die to make my discovery possible. Remember, Emma, this proves my grandmother falsified some evidence. I never had thought her capable of such contemptible behaviour, but there it is. What it doesn't prove, however, is that the verdict was false. We're still left with the fact that your father paid Edmund Tully £500 2 days before the murder. He said he gave Tully the money for old time's sake. £500, that must be several thousands at today's prices, is simply not credible. You think Vickers made up something pretty similar to what they actually said, don't you? I think it's still the likeliest explanation. But one man could tell us for certain, Tully. Yes, no one's seen him for 12 years. What next then? I'll go up to the Hebden Bridge and see what I can find out. There might be a friend or relative of Tully's there who can put me on the right track. When will you go? At the weekend. I'll have to get some work done before then, you know, the kinds that pays. She grins. Yes, I know. And are you in a hurry to get back to Pangbourne? If not, maybe I could buy you a cup of tea. There's a cafe on the other side of the lake. Thanks, that'll be nice. We rose and started walking slowly around the perimeter of the lake, unless there's somebody waiting for you at home, of course. I was fishing for information, as her smile seemed to acknowledge. Like I told you, solitude's a habit of mine. See those flats over there? She pointed back at the high-rise blocks that loomed like the messes and butts of a desert landscape beyond the red brick Victorian terrace flanking the park. One of those windows is mine, and unless I'm being burgled again, there's no one on the other side of it. Even though ever thought of leaving London? Where would I go? And what would I go there with? Most weeks I can barely pay the rent. It's if it's as bad as that, maybe I could. Don't say it. She shook her head vigorously. I'm not looking for handouts. It wouldn't exactly be that. It would be to me. But if things had gone just a little differently back in 47, your family would have been rich. Don't you think that hasn't crossed my mind? What's the first thing you'd do if you suddenly came into money? She looked at the sky as if in search of inspiration. Oh, I don't know. Fly to Paris for the weekend, I suppose. Even ever been there? Paris, never. Her head drooped. You need a birth certificate before you can apply for a passport, and Emma Morosco never has been born. Even fantasies, it seems, were forfeited in the shadowy world Nicky's sister had been compelled to inhabit. As we walked in the silence of her punctured dreams, I thought of how different our lives might have been, hers and mine, if Edmund Tully and Michael Lanyon had never met, if Tully hadn't gone to Truro in the summer of 1947, if Uncle Joshua had died in bed a few years later of manifestly natural causes, then the past would unravel like a rope twisted against its core, and Michael Lanyon would never have stood in the dock at Bodmin to answer a charge of murder. According to the newspaper reports, which were all I had to go on, the first few days of the trial, during which the prosecution presented its case, were simply a grander and lengthier rerun of the hearing, and a compelling case it seemed to be. Only now, as I review what went on in that courtroom in Bodmin, while I puzzled over algebra or floundered on the rugger pitch at Truro School, does the invidious of Michael Lanyon's plight reveal itself to my mind. Edmund Tully's guilt was undeniable, even though, at least at the outset, he did deny it. The problem Michael Lanyon counsel faced was that the joint prosecution implied a joint defence, even though there was nothing of the kind. Lanyon and Tully, the newspapers caught them, and so they were in the public mind as well, perhaps as the jurors, a partnership in crime. The evidence against Michael Lanyon himself came down to the money he paid Tully and the conversations they had when the money changed hands. By the time he entered the witness box to explain the first and deny the second, the limelight had been seized by Tully's change of plea. It was a dramatic stuff, of course. One of the defendants was throwing in his hand, confessing to a capital crime. And since everybody believed his confession, it seemed to follow, given that his co-defendant had a motive for the murder and he didn't, that the Crown's contention was proved. The two men had conspired together to murder Joshua Connerworth. Both were guilty, and one of them even had the decency to admit it. It looked all the blacker. Therefore, for the one who didn't, the prime mover, as the prosecuting counsel called him, the true villain of the piece. Justice was a summary business pack back in 1947. Nowadays, the case would wait in the legal queue for a year or more before coming to court and would drag on for a couple of months when it eventually did. But it was a different world then, in more ways than one. Tully's plea of change came in on the 6th day of the trial. By the 8th, it was done and dusted. It was Mr. Clerk's clerk, I had later learned, Mr. Rowe, who called with words of the verdict. We were gathered at the dining room table for high tea when the telephone rang in the hall. Dad went to answer it. Said little more than I could hear. Then, yes, I see, and thank you. Then returned to the table, announced impassively that Michael Lanyon had been found guilty, and commenced serving the cold cuts with a luring brow that served notice of a ban on all discussion. He didn't mention to the sentence, and I remained in some slight doubt on the point, wondering, however, illogically, if the mandatory death sentence for murder really meant the judge had no discretion. I would have asked Dad if his expression had been less forbidding. As it was, I had to rely on Pam's confirmation of my understanding of the law when we conferred in her bedroom afterwards, and even then I didn't quite believe it until the headline in the following day's Western Morning News bestowed bestowed its printed authority on the outcome. True murder paired to hang. There really was, it seemed, no room for doubt. The Senate Club, in or more accurately under Piccadilly, was close to its nadir in terms of seductive ambience. When I paid my extortionate temporary membership fee and descended to the bar early that evening, the stage was empty, the music barely audible, the atmosphere lethargic, all of which was as I hoped, since it meant that Frankie the barman didn't mind talking to me, although his enthusiasm faltered slightly when I slipped the photograph out of its envelope and asked him if he recognised the woman on the bed. Maybe, he said wearily, after amused and prolonged scrutiny. Is she a member? Could be. Come here often? Does she? Not sure. I see a name. I need a name and address. More than my job's worth. But is it more than 50 quid's worth? Maybe not, he shrugged. I could ask around and see what I could find out, you know. Here's my number. I scribbled it on a paper coaster and handed it to him. And down payment. I laid out a £10 note on the bar. Make it 20, he grinned. Well, it's not a local call, is it? I added a fiver to the tenner, and he settled for that. Can't guarantee nothing, mind, he said as he folded the notes into the waistcoat pocket. Could have registered under false name, couldn't she? There's a lot of it about how true that was. The odds, I admitted to myself as I drove back to Pangbourne, was that the Zenith Club was a dead end. Pauline Lucas, aka Laura Banks, Marilyn Buckley, and a possible clutch of other pseudonyms wasn't going to leave any clues behind her unless it suited her purpose to do so. When I next encountered her, as I didn't doubt I would, it would almost certainly be at her instigation, not mine. That was what was so worrying. As it turned out, however, I didn't have to worry for long. I'd not been at home more than 5 minutes when the telephone rang. Where have you been? A voice I could hardly believe I recognised chidingly inquired. This is the 4th time I've rung. Miss Lucas? Yes, Mr. Napier. Surprised to hear from me? Not exactly. What do you want? I thought you might want to chat. And if I do, then I'm available. Now, this very evening. Where are you? At your workshop? Where? Don't you believe me? Without further ado, she put down the telephone impatiently. I dialed the workshop number. She answered at the first ring. You ought to improve your security, Mr. Napier. You know that? I mean, you don't even have a burglar alarm. I'm surprised the insurance company doesn't insist you install one. Assuming you're insured, of course. But you must be, I suppose, with all those valuable old cars about the place. It's not as if most of them actually belong to you, is it? So the consequence of our fire could be... I dropped the telephone and raced from the house. I should have seen this coming. I really should. She'd found my weakness just as she found she had Trevor's. But how far did she mean to go? The absence of a clue, however slim, clogged my thought like static as I pitched the stag through the potholes of the road, sped through Pangbourne High Street at approximately twice the speed limit, and roared up the lanes towards Bower Shore Farm. It was a hoax, I told myself, nothing but an evil-minded trick. She wouldn't do it. She couldn't. But she had. I saw the glow of fire beyond the bank as I rounded the last bend before the entrance to the yard. I pulled up in the gateway and jumped out, petrol fume and the stench of burning rubber wafting through the heat towards me. I stopped, my eyes smiling from the smoke as I stared at the roaring inferno, visible through the half-open workshop door. 8 years, 6 classic cars, 2 livelihoods, and 1 carefully cultivated business was going up in flames in front of me, and all I could do was watch. Thanks for listening.